So for our third speaker before we take a break, and before you'll have some more chance to have caffeine and rehydrate and take care of biology and all those important processes, I want to introduce Dr. Jennifer Blesh. She is an assistant professor here at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. She's also from the Cornell Mafia, so we work very hard to get this group here, and we're trying to transform the University of Michigan accordingly. I actually went on a junior faculty sabbatical once to Cornell, so I feel like an honorary Cornell, and my uncle went there in soil science way back when. So now you know why I really am very proud of Cornell. So Jennifer is trained broadly as an agroecologist, and she uses interdisciplinary research approaches. She's very interested in understanding how different agri-food systems may impact both ecological as well as social processes. And in particular, she puts attention on alternative production-consumption relations motivated by a desire to support development of ecologically sustainable as well as equitable food systems. So, Dr. Blesh.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm really humbled by this opportunity to get to share some thoughts on this topic with all of you. A lot of people in this room do similar work. And so I'm hoping to really just spark conversation here and bring in a lot of those voices. What's ironic about this talk for me is that I've actually, as a natural scientist, I spent a number of years giving talks to my peer group about the need to broaden their epistemological portfolio, right? We need to value other ways of knowing about the world besides just measuring and counting it. And what I'm going to do today is actually a little bit of the reverse. So this is strange for me, but I want to, in this audience that has a lot of social scientists and representatives from social movements, talk about the importance of bringing in certain forms of Western science more heavily into the conversation about ecology and food sovereignty. So similar to conversations that are being had about the role of ecology and political ecology, for example, I want to talk about some ways of elevating the ecology of agroecology and the agroecology of food sovereignty. So we'll see how that goes. And I want to start with the social movement definition of agroecology, and to put that front and center, that this is really informing and guiding what I do and is critically important. So Villa Campesina, talks about agroecology as a key element in the construction of food sovereignty, as a form of resistance, which is a really important dimension. It's based on ecological principles, and they talk a lot about place-based and traditional or farmer forms of knowledge, right, developed through our innovation and research. So I want to make it very clear that I think all of these dimensions are incredibly valuable and important. That said, I have a few concerns. So this last semester, we led a graduate seminar on food sovereignty, had lots of excellent conversations with graduate students, and it was an opportunity for me to really re-engage with the literature on food sovereignty. And I'll admit that I found myself bristling occasionally when I saw the word science in quotes, or phrases like balance of nature and regenerative cycles and ecologies used as sort of synonym for environment or nature, cosmovision. And while I value all of these ways of knowing about the world, I think there's some danger in this almost quasi-religious representation of agroecology. So I want to bring some attention, or maybe extend the conversation and be a little bit provocative today, and partly building on what was said yesterday about what is the role of academics or researchers in this conversation. And I just put up one example quote here. There are many like this. I think there's a lot of sort of non-nuanced claims like this in the literature that, while they have truth to them, we have to sort of question, well, what about the socio-ecological complexity, or how does this actually play out in practice? It's probably pretty variable. So what I want to do today is address these questions. How can we integrate more ecology into food sovereignty framings of agroecology, and to what effect? Why does it matter? These arguments that I'm making. So food sovereignty poses an alternative to the industrialization of agriculture, and you all know this very well. I just want to remind everyone that this is the general trend of the industrialization of agriculture. Historically, we relied on species diversity and ecological processes to maintain ecosystem function and food production, and over time, with the simplification and specialization of systems, we've come to rely more on external inputs to carry out those functions. So policy has really emphasized production at any cost, right? And I think part of the issue here, or part of why the food sovereignty movement has can occasionally come across as sort of anti-science is that the industrialization of agriculture was really fueled by the science of agronomy. A lot of Western science went into the industrialization and specialization of agriculture. So I want to define some terms here. Agronomy is the science and technology of using plants for food, fuel, feed, and fiber. It tends to have as its goals yield, production, profit, has been strongly influenced by national policy and flows of power. We should acknowledge it's a very interdisciplinary field. It links a lot of types of knowledge, weed science, soil science, plant pathology. It tends to get criticized by ecologists for being very empirical, product-oriented, and sort of lacking some theoretical perspectives, and then criticized by social movements for its tendency to have the top-down linear transfer of knowledge. In contrast, ecology is the scientific study of interrelationships among organisms, between organisms and their environment. It's had as its goal, at least historically, an understanding of natural systems, particularly from a systems or synthetic perspective. It is very heavily focused on theory development and conceptual models. And in fact, ecology has been criticized for sometimes being overly theoretical, not necessarily paying attention to managed systems or what these theories mean in practice. Ecologists have developed a systems-based framework that I think can be very useful in organizing the way we approach agricultural systems. So that's the ecosystem. This might be a lot of review for many of you, but just want to remind you what the ecosystem concept is, thinking about interactions between organisms and their environment, their abiotic environment, and flows of energy and matter and materials through that environment. And building on what was said yesterday, what I think is really key about the ecosystem concept as an organizing principle for agroecology is this ability to integrate across scales. So I started that first slide by saying the food sovereignty movement often frames agroecology as being very place-based and in particular places, and I acknowledge that that's very true. But we now need much greater understanding about how farms and fields located in particular places have impacts at larger spatial scales. These things are all connected. And the ecosystem concept, for example, allows us to address questions, well, about mechanisms, for example, of how nutrients are released in the plant root zone, how that can feed back to have impacts on global climate change. So these are really important dimensions of the ecosystem framework for agroecology. So just to summarize that background, it blends theories and methods from agronomy and ecology, trying to bridge some of the strengths of both of those approaches. Second point I want to make early on, and somewhat strongly, is that all farms are agroecosystems and can be studied from that ecological perspective. So rather than using a narrow definition of agroecology as sort of a catalog or list of particular practices, I want to shift to emphasizing from the academic perspective the use of theory to analyze processes within all different types of agroecosystems. So just academic definitions to summarize what I've already said: application of ecological theory to design, analysis, and management, emphasizing processes that are governed by ecosystems, and encompassing to greater or lesser degrees social dimensions. And this is something we can talk about more here. Most agroecologists consider agroecosystems as embedded in a social context. But what I'd like to really argue for today is the need for linking critical social science perspectives with robust ecological research, and that's really tricky to do. They're both very specialized in pretty different fields, but I think it's a direction that is going to be really necessary for advancing food sovereignty. So building on that, there are many types of agroecosystems one could consider. You all know this: grain, vegetable, livestock, perennial, annual. And there's a lot of properties and processes that we can analyze or understand, things like production, nutrient retention, agrobiodiversity, decomposition, organic matter accrual, yield stability. So there are lots of dimensions with which academics and farmers can engage. So there are really two distinct goals of ecological research that I'm trying to highlight. The first is building agroecological theory to understand agricultural systems. And a point, I'm going to show you some examples of this. All agroecosystems have variable outcomes. So most agroecologists are careful to to point out, for example, that organic farming as a category is hugely problematic. There's lots of variability within organic farming. I would say when we say agroecological practices, the same thing applies. There's a lot of variability in terms of how management drives outcomes, and this is a tool through which we can understand that. And the second goal would be then the practical piece. How do we develop and design and manage systems? And that's really bringing in the farmer knowledge and experience piece as well. So building on a little bit of what was discussed yesterday, the role for researchers, I think Hannah mentioned this idea of pathways to practice. How do we get to food sovereignty in practice? And I think in the case of the natural sciences, for ecology, there's really a clear role to be had in terms of evidence informing policy, if we can actually say something about how management systems lead to particular outcomes. But I'm saying all of this with great caution. There's a need for even greater interdisciplinarity and reflexivity, right? So it's not easy to bridge these worlds. We need to assess the multifunctional outcomes of food systems. So maybe there's a particular ecological outcome of interest, but there might be trade-offs with other social or political outcomes. So analyzing these things in holistic ways is necessary. Recognizing that science, of course, has a context, so the questions we decide to ask or how we have resources to ask them are shaped by a lot of other factors. Thinking, as Annette mentioned yesterday, who's served by your science or who's served by your research. But if we keep all of those things in mind, I think there are real opportunities here to harness our academic resources to advance the public good. And I come out of a land grant background, as was mentioned. The extent to which Cornell actually does that is debatable, but as Phil mentioned yesterday, there's a lot of conversations about moving in that direction. So now that we've got some history and terminology, what does ecology have to offer? I want to say a little bit more about that. So first, ecologists were really at the forefront of identifying the consequences of intensification. So in this early paper by Mattson, and there were other papers coming out at this time, there was a lot of discussion of the biological consequences of intensification. We could identify changes in soil biota, changing processes, changes in natural resources. Agriculture is a prime user of fresh water, for example. And then identifying really strong linkages between agriculture and its surrounding landscapes and actually affecting climate change and water quality. So at a global scale, we live in a time of rapid change, and ecologists have been sort of central in identifying a lot of these trends, increases in concentrations of greenhouse gas, increased fertilizer use, increased population. And one of the points that I want to make is that given this context of rapid global change, I think there's an even greater case or need for the integration of multiple knowledges to understand how to farm more sustainably in this context. So traditional agriculture evolved over many millennia, but suddenly the sort of context for that knowledge is changing very quickly. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The industrialization of agriculture has contributed also to many of those trends I was just showing you, such that today we're experiencing what I would call, with some inspiration from John Vandermeer, the metabolic rift squared. So in early agriculture, there were very tight linkages between people and the resource base upon which they depended. And Marx's term for the spatial separation of social production from its biological base is called metabolic rift. And he was writing at a time, building on Liebig and others, when we were just starting to understand a lot about soil biology and soil chemistry. And he was really concerned that by segregating people and production, we were depleting resources in one place and then concentrating waste in another. Well, as you all know, today we have an even more extreme situation. We have crops over here and livestock over here, and they've all become increasingly intensified, such that the effects of those changes are actually global in reach. It's pretty dramatic. Humans have changed nutrient cycling on a global scale, and that's pretty profound, and I would think Marx would have something to say about that as well, I'm sure. So the point is that farms and fields, as I mentioned, they're in a broader landscaped context. So we can't just think about a place-based farm, but how the farm is managed is going to have consequences at very local scales. This is Lake Erie, but also at global scales. Many of you have seen this map. It's the dead zones that are now identified around the world caused by nitrogen pollution. So I want to provide a couple of specific examples of what I'm talking about, of what ecological management might look like, using nitrogen as an example because it's what I happen to study, but also because it's a really important global change problem of our time that contributes to big changes in water quality and air quality. I guess I'll say first here, just so that in case anyone is completely in the dust, nitrogen is a really key element that limits crop productivity. It's the most, on a global scale, the most limiting nutrient. So humans have widely increased our inputs of nitrogen to landscapes in order to increase yields. And that's what's driving these losses. So from an ecological perspective, these aren't great pictures. I just grabbed them from a textbook, but we can have a terrestrial nitrogen cycle like in a forest. And there are inputs and outputs of nitrogen to that forest that are usually pretty small. And the nitrogen cycle is dominated by these internal cycling processes that microbes carry out, and they tend to sustain production over time with minimal leakiness. In agriculture, we have a really different situation. We're constantly removing big amounts of nitrogen when we harvest crops and are eating them. And so to compensate for that, in industrial agriculture, the approach has been to, well, flood the system with fertilizer nitrogen to replace that and increase yields. And as a consequence, it pushes all of these other loss pathways that are normally quite small, such that we have greater gaseous losses or greater losses and pollution of water. One thing that ecology contributes, this is just a concrete example of a method or an approach to assess sustainability, is a mass balance. So that's a tool where we can actually measure all of the nutrients or carbon, for example, going into a bounded system, let's say a field or a farm, and all of the nutrients or carbon that leave, and assess the difference between those two as a metric of sustainability. So if, for example, inputs of nitrogen are much bigger than outputs for a very long period of time, the likely result is going to be losses and pollution. In contrast, if the outputs are constantly greater than the inputs, you're going to be degrading soil quality or the sustainability of the system in another direction. This is one example of how we can use the tools of ecology to understand variability and sustainability. And in fact, I applied this tool to these are a bunch of farm fields in the Midwest. And what's interesting here, and this is a key point that I want to make, these are all diversified and organic farms. So these are all farms that are fairly, we would say, sustainable from a number of perspectives. But you can see there's a big range in this metric of sustainability. Some of these farms are actually likely going to lead to pollution in the long term. So it's important to note that even within organic or diversified agriculture, there can be a lot of variability in terms of these particular outcomes, and we can use these tools to actually highlight and measure this complexity. And what we found in this particular study was that farms relying on nitrogen as their main source had more balanced nitrogen budgets than farms that were relying more heavily on manure.
Sorry, could you say that again?
That last part. So the organic farms that were using more, they had incorporated more legumes as their source of nitrogen. They had more balanced inputs and outputs of nitrogen compared to farms that had large inputs of manure. So how you're managing the farm matters, right? Management can map onto particular outcomes. This is just to show you, this is how ecologists conceive of a paradigm for ecological nutrient management, and it's really complex. So this is going back to what we said yesterday. This can be a very knowledge-intensive approach, and farmer knowledge is a really important piece of it, but there's still a lot that we can learn about the mechanisms governing all of these processes and pushing the system in different directions. For example, understanding how nutrients are released from different fractions of organic matter. And these things are all driven by microbes. And microbes require carbon as their energy source to fuel all of their activities. So how this differs from an agronomic perspective is thinking about managing carbon and nitrogen together and managing the soil-plant system in a more systemic way. One of the contradictions of my talk today is that I'm arguing we need more agroecology, but on the other hand, we don't really know what we're talking about. So we've learned a lot, but this stuff is really complicated. How microbes turn over nutrients in the soil is just this big frontier of research right now. There's a lot of excitement around it. There are some things we know a lot about. So a lot of studies have looked at certain key relationships between plants and microbes, like legumes and the rhizobia bacteria that live in their roots, or between corn and mycorrhizal fungi. So we know a lot about particular areas, but we're just starting to learn, for example, that for non-symbiotic associations, there's actually complex communication going on between plants and their associated microbes. Plants can actually shift how and where and when they allocate carbon in order to access different patches of nutrients. And what's interesting to me is that these processes evolved over huge periods of time, and we can harness some of these coevolutionary processes for more sustainable management, but the industrial approach has been to just override them and ignore them and replace them with chemical inputs. So the point is we still have a lot to learn, and this is really a pretty big frontier of research. One other example, looking at the other major loss pathway of nitrogen, so thinking about nitrogen as contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change, we know that on balance, if you look at all types of cropping systems, the global warming potential of diversified or agroecological systems is lower than of conventional systems. But nitrous oxide emissions, that's what's on this y-axis, they're really variable in both space and time. This is showing temporal variability. And these are all organic and diversified systems on this graph. They all have pulses of N2O release. And in this particular study that came out recently, those happened right after particular management events that we can identify. So beginning to explain more of these mechanisms is a really key area for Western scientific knowledge in certain forms to contribute to our understanding of sustainable management. We all know that reducing nitrous oxide emissions is an important goal. I want to show you one final example. This is data from our work. This is bringing it a little bit back more to the subject of this conference. This is work that I did with a food sovereignty movement in Brazil, so with the MST on land reform settlements. And what was interesting about this study is that all of the farmers in this sample, all of the farmers that we worked with, self-identified as agroecological, right? They would say that they're doing agroecological farming, and that's what's promoted by the MST at a national scale. And we measured together with them a bunch of indicators or metrics of agroecosystem performance. And this is just an example to show you that these were two different communities, all within this sample, and they had very different outcomes for agroecosystem performance. One community had much greater agrobiodiversity, much greater soil fertility. There are other figures I could show you. So this is pretty interesting. Evidence that agroecology outcomes can vary greatly in response to different management and environment. What was also interesting in this case is that the main driver of these differences is social variables in this case. So Brazil has some really interesting national programs to advance food sovereignty practices, and these communities had really differential access to those state resources and access to knowledge and credit, for example. So I say this at the end to bring it back around to that need for integration of political ecology or political economy knowledge with ecological knowledge. So I'm going to try to wrap some of these things up. I actually don't think these are conclusions. I'd like to keep it more open in terms of hearing from all of you and sparking discussion. Not sure why that's advancing on its own. So the application of the ecosystem concept has become widespread in academia. And I think that's really good news. That's very exciting. And part of what I hope we can do with that is think about how to elevate ecology within agroecology and food sovereignty in the context of epistemological pluralism and transdisciplinary collaboration. So I'm not talking about hegemonic top-down linear natural science. I just want to make that clear again, but highlight how more nuance, more specificity is actually helpful. And I think some of these general statements, like the ones I put up at the beginning, tend to obscure a lot. If a sociologist were up here, they would probably be very careful to say, you know, I'm talking about an anti-essentialist, non-romantic view of the peasantry. And I'm saying exactly the same thing. This is my anti-essentialist, non-romantic view of agroecology. And if we take that view, it's really an ideal framework for mapping agricultural practices onto outcomes and potentially, hopefully, informing more sustainable management. So in that sense, I think it's an ideal model for advancing food sovereignty, particularly if we think about the earlier definitions we heard yesterday, autonomy from upstream markets, et cetera. And I'll just end by reiterating that, again, it's not so simple. And there's a lot that we need to know, but I think that's also exciting. So thank you. Time for a few questions? Great. John.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation. I just wanted to add something, though. When you said that in agroecology we don't know what the hell we're doing.
That is what I said, yes.
And you're right, but you're right squared. Yeah, put it that way. I mean, you work in ecosystems ecology, really. I work in population community ecology. And my framework is looking more at pest control. You look at nutrient cycling. I would say that we know far less about the ecology of pest control than we know about nutrient cycling. So what you said about what we don't know was really minimizing what we don't know.
Thanks for saying that, because I was actually going to, somewhere in my notes a while ago, I had, many different types of people could give the talk that I just gave, including our ecologists in the room who study pests, and they would have similar points to make. I was focusing on the area that I happen to know a lot about. Yeah.
There's growing interest in hydroponics, aquaponics, indoor vertical growing systems. How do you feel about that within the context of agroecology and food sovereignty?
I have a lot of feelings about that. Let me see if I can summarize. I think in some ways those are pretty complex systems to manage ecologically. Soil is this amazing resource, and when we take that out of the system, it becomes harder to think about how to manage it organically, but I know a lot of people are working in that area. I'm not specifically. So I would say within the realm of hydroponics, there's a lot that we have to learn, maybe even more that we have to learn about how to do that in sustainable ways. The other thing I would say, so there's a lot of interest in my Agro Ecosystem class in those types of approaches that are really taking off in urban settings. And I just like to bring the discussion back to just thinking about where it fits in terms of actual diets, right? So grains are 70% of our caloric intake, and so we can't ignore the rural systems. I think we just need to bring those into the fold and also, increase our ecological understanding of them. But in terms of supplying, the majority of our diets, I don't think we're going to get there. But I think they're really important, as, I don't know, Andy could say more about this in terms of maybe helping to meet nutritional goals or for educational purposes or food security purposes. But as far as staples go, I think we need all of those. Yeah.
2 quick comments and a request. In Cuba, they had a whole bunch of hydroponic systems before the collapse of trade relations, and when they couldn't import the nutrients that had to go into the water, they threw out all the water and put soil into the same containers, and discovered they could have much more sustainable urban production with soil that they call organoponics instead of hydroponics. The other point, I forgot what it was, so I'll just go straight to the request, which is that I felt like you were teasing us at the end with the MST example from Mato Grosso. We just saw a graph that showed percent sold, and you said there were dramatic differences, but I'd like to actually know what differences and the relationships.
Yeah, so that graph, just to reiterate, was showing agrobiodiversity number of crops sold. So one community was selling an average of 14 crops, and the other community was selling an average of 3. So even though that second community that was just selling 3 crops, they were fairly low input, they were actually still sticking with the sort of typical commodity staples of the region that are sold through intermediaries or distributors, whereas the other community had been able to really completely shift their entire management system in response to access to stable markets that were provided through the food acquisition program under the FOMI Zero umbrella. And there are a number, I could send you the paper. There were another number of other metrics that we measured, but really interesting how the impact of this program in driving a complete management shift with then cascading impacts on ecological outcomes.
I remember my comment. My comment is, I think it's important that ecologists and agroecologists learn about all the things that we still don't know, but in the meantime, farmers can't wait.
Exactly.
And so we have these incredible peasant-to-peasant and farmer-to-farmer systems that are transforming entire landscapes into agroecology territories. And if they were going to wait for academic researchers to figure out the finer-tuned details of pest ecology or nutrient cycling, they wouldn't have done anything yet. And American farmers are in very severe crisis, and they have to get out of it the fastest way they can.
No, I agree, and that's why I started by saying this is a little ironic for me, because usually I give the talk that says, we already know far more ecology than what we're applying to the landscape, to say exactly that point. And it's a bit of a swinging of the pendulum. The other point I wanted to make about the MST system that was really interesting is that huge increase in soil fertility on those diversified farms was due to manure inputs. And they were getting that manure from a chicken feedlot nearby. So it's sort of being, in that stage propped up still by the industrial system. And so we had a lot of conversations with farmers where they said, we know, agroecology should maybe move in the direction of legume management or thinking more about input self-sufficiency, but we don't have access to seeds or knowledge about legumes. So now we're working together with them. We have an on-farm trial with 6 different legume species, and they're working with us on management. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in that way, exactly for the back and forth of emerging ecological knowledge and longstanding farmer tradition and knowledge. There's a couple of hands. Okay, one more. Yeah.
Very quick, I really appreciate your approach of de-romanticizing, because that is definitely an issue I found.
Can you speak louder?
Oh, sorry.
Maybe stand up so that people in the back.
So she started by saying she appreciates the de-romanticized perspective.
And that's the point. But I think that part of the romantic or religious or quasi-religious issue is an issue of power, because the agricultural industry and the scientific community have a power that peasants and farmers frequently don't have. And can you address those power dynamics a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think even within the natural sciences, that's something I've been trying to grapple. The why is it that particular forms of Western science have come to dominate or inform agricultural production versus others? And that's absolutely a socio-political and historical reason. So I think, all I can really say to that is that I've made this case for the need of certain or specified forms of knowledge, but we have to constantly pay attention to that context and flows of power. And I think scientists have an important responsibility there, which is what I was trying to say about reflexivity and understanding your position and the effects that your work has. So it's an activist scholar's stance of how you select particular research questions and who your research is serving. That's a great point, thanks.